Hey everybody, it's Rabbit. Welcome back to the channel. And today we're going to be starting a little series on different CAS options or close air support options in the game of War Thunder, specifically in ground realistic battles modes. Arcade battles and simulator battles are a little different, and we're not really going to be touching on those. Now, when I first started playing ground realistic, the idea of getting a plane, much less a good plane or a fully loaded plane, was just beyond my wildest dreams. But I've kind of gotten to the point right now where if I want to take a plane out, even if it's a pretty heavily kitted one with something like AGM-65 Mavericks, I can generally get the spawn points for that pretty easily. So I figured I'd do a little guide. So join us for this installment. We're going to be looking at guns, rockets, bombs, essentially the unguided stuff, and giving you some general tips on things like approaches and stuff like that. Now, first off, some general tips. A lot of planes in the game right now have custom loadouts. I have an entire video on that. I will have a link in the comments down below, so you can check that out if you want to. That goes over not just how to build custom loadouts, but how individual weapons will affect your spawn cost. So it's a pretty useful little guide, especially if you're newer to CAS or you don't really understand exactly how different weapon systems interact with that. Obviously, I won't be going over a lot of that here because it's just going to be pretty redundant when I have an entire video covering it. Now, one last thing about CAS before we get into the full video is a lot of people, when they look at planes, see them as being very powerful, and while they can destroy ground targets pretty efficiently, the problem is they cost a ton of spawn points, and once you're out of ordnance, you have to go back and rearm. So you end up with a lot of downtime in planes unless you're just ejecting out, and if you take out a plane and you only get one kill, you basically wasted a ton of spawn points. You might as well just take it out of a tank and you'd probably get the same results. The big advantage of planes is that they can be anywhere they need to be on the battlefield very quickly. So what you should be doing is you should be looking for enemies that are in difficult spots that your team is having trouble with. You should be looking for enemies on capture points, protecting friendlies on capture points, things like that if you really want to be impactful and make your spawn of a plane as worthwhile as possible for your team. But of course, everybody is always tempted by the prospect of revenge CAS and just taking out the person who took you out, and I would be lying if I said I was completely above that. It's just important to keep in the back of your head that if you're doing this, you're not exactly doing the most efficient actions or the most impactful ones. Now, in the spawn screen, when you're selecting an aircraft, there's a bunch of different settings. As far as the fuel setting, you're generally going to want to take as little as you can get away with unless you have a plane with afterburners. If you have a jet with afterburners, then you need to start looking at taking out more fuel, potentially up towards of 20 minutes. But most of the prop planes that we're going to be going over for this basic section are really going to be able to run an entire match with just a basic fuel load, so no real problems there. For the later videos, such as the ones covering guided munitions, that's when you have to start looking at taking out planes with larger fuel loads, just so you don't run out of gas in the middle of a bombing run. Since guns are very basic to every CAS, the vast majority of CAS planes have them, useful to look at that first. So the first characteristic of guns in the settings screen is the gun targeting distance. This is essentially your horizontal convergence. This is mostly for World War II era planes where you have the guns mounted far out on the wing, because this will tell you at what point the guns are essentially crossing each other in front of you. I personally set mine to 500 meters, but honestly, you could just set it to whatever you want, whatever is easiest for you to aim. It doesn't really matter that much, it's just whatever you can use. There's no right or wrong answer. Now, vertical targeting is another feature that's kind of interesting. Briefly going over it, essentially, if you don't have vertical targeting enabled, your bullets fly straight out the plane and will drop. If you do have vertical targeting enabled, they will go upwards and then drop down to whatever your gun targeting distance is. So if I set my gun targeting to 500 meters and I have vertical targeting enabled, that means that they will basically be going through directly where I am aiming at 500 meters. This might seem like a really useful setting, and you might be asking yourself, why does nobody use them? Well, the problem is, if your guns are always shooting slightly up, that gets really disorienting if your plane is tilted to the side or is upside down. If your plane is upside down, now your bullets are dropping way lower than you expect. If you're at the side, they start dropping in really weird angles. And if the target is within your gun targeting distance, now your bullets are actually going above where you're aiming. So that's really disorienting, and that's part of the reason why basically nobody uses vertical targeting. But take it out in the test drive, try it for yourself in a few missions. There's nothing wrong with using it if you can get the hang of it, but most people just don't really understand it and aren't very good with it. The next topic is selecting your ammunition belts. There are two different characteristics in the belt you look at. Number one is the types of ammunition within the belt, and number two is the ratio of ammo to the belt. And generally speaking, when you're looking at the penetration characteristics, it's going to have the penetration characteristics of whatever piece of ammo in the belt has the highest penetration. So for example, if you had armor piercing to high explosive, and you had a 1 armor piercing to every 3 high explosive, it would show you the stats for the armor piercing, but not every bullet in that belt is going to have it. So when you're selecting belts, it's important to look at both what types of ammunition it has and the ratio of ammunition. And as I mentioned in the loadout video, if you start selecting ammunition that is particularly effective for ground battles, you're probably going to increase your spawn cost by doing so. To use an example, the A10, the base belt on the A10, has a 1-to-1 armor piercing to high explosive, whereas the upgraded anti-armor belt has a 3-to-1 armor piercing to high explosive. Given the rate of fire of the gun, this isn't really that much of an upgrade, and the amount of spawn cost it increases by is pretty substantial, so I wouldn't really recommend it. But there are a lot of heavy gun-based CAS aircraft that really need effective anti-armor belts to be effective, so it's kind of a vehicle-by-vehicle basis. Now, the actual bullet physics in terms of targeting something with a gun in the air isn't that different on the ground. The big thing you have to remember is essentially the drift of the plane. So if your plane is slightly drifting to the left or right, your bullets will also slightly drift to the left or right. Additionally, if you're going straight down, it's important to remember the wind coming up is going to generate lift under your wings, so it's going to push you and your bullets slightly up. So you're going to have to aim a little lower than you would expect. But broadly speaking, the physics are actually pretty straightforward. Now, as far as gun passes, doing a 90-degree angle is the most effective because it gives you the most penetration and it gets you to target the weakest parts of the armor. However, it gives you the least time on target because obviously you're going straight down at high speeds. You have to pull up earlier, etc., etc. So usually anywhere from a 45 to a 60-degree angle is preferable. And obviously if you're just going straight on, flat with the ground almost, your penetration is going to be significantly reduced, so unless you have a pretty powerful gun or a very weak enemy, this is usually not ideal in terms of approach angles, but it's kind of situational. The big advantage to gun CAS is that you generally have a lot more ammunition than you do with things like rockets or bombs, so a plane with a good cannon can absolutely wreak havoc if you're landing your shots pretty accurately. It's also important to remember with planes that because you can often hit the weakest part of the enemy armor, it's worth considering shells that maybe have a little less penetration in favor of shells that do a lot more damage. For example, if you just have a solid shot armor piercing shell that has a lot of penetration, or an armor piercing high explosive that has a little less armor penetration but has a lot more damage, that APHE round is probably going to be significantly better because you're not going to get that many passes and your time on target is very short. So you want to maximize the damage per shot rather than just making sure the shots go through armor. And it behooves you to basically get better at aiming rather than just try to take ammo that requires less aim. And that's kind of similar to how it works with ground RB with stuff like APCR and APHE rounds, where you don't want to be using the APCR at all, you want to be using the APHE. Very similar for how it works with planes. Now when it comes to rockets are going to function very similarly to guns in terms of their arc, although they aren't going to drop as badly near the end of their arc, and that's about the biggest difference you're going to run into. As far as settings, rockets do have one setting where you can fuse them to detonate at a certain distance. This is basically useless in ground battles. It's really only used in air battles if you want to try to get cheeky kills on enemy planes and head-ons or something like that. So you can kind of ignore this setting. Rockets in general tend to be the most powerful weapon against open-top vehicles. While you can technically use bombs for this, rockets are usually lighter and you can carry more of them. So for open-top vehicles like usually enemy anti-air, rockets are typically the preferred weapon. Overall, rockets are fairly easy to aim, especially because they have a relatively flat trajectory. They don't have a ton of drop, unlike guns can, especially at longer distances. So if you get pretty skilled with them, you can land hits at pretty long ranges. The biggest limitation, though, is that if you're trying to take out heavily armored targets, you usually need much more precise hits with rockets. So you're going to have to hit things like the roof, or if it's an armor-piercing rocket with a heat warhead, you're going to have to hit specifically things like ammo or hit the crew compartment just right. It's not impossible, obviously, you can easily do it, but it does require a lot more practice. One other thing with rockets is you need to understand their firing sequence, like do they fire in pairs or do they fire individually, and if they fire individually, what is the sequence? For example, on the Israeli Spitfires, they have a total of 16 rockets. All of them fire individually. They start firing on the left, and then they alternate left to right. So as long as you remember which side is firing at any given time, you can actually land some very precise shots with them. But that is kind of the trick, is you do have to memorize the firing sequence and even which rocket you're on as you're shooting. Overall, rockets are just a great weapon at engaging very light vehicles at longer ranges, and can still have some applications against much heavier targets, depending on the exact characteristics of the rocket. And for our last piece of ordnance today, we're going to be looking at the good old-fashioned bomb. Now, one thing that you look at with bombs in the spawn screen is that you have the bomb fuse timer. The bomb fuse timer tells you the delay from when your bomb hits the ground to when it actually explodes. It's important to remember that you want this timer to be as short as possible so that the enemy doesn't get a chance to react, but also as long as you can get away with so that you can actually get a chance to escape from the blast radius. Otherwise, you'll just end up blowing yourself up. This is going to vary a lot based on the plane, what altitude you're dropping at, how powerful the bomb is. For example, if you were taking something like a B-17 out and you were dropping from like 2,000 feet, you don't really care. You can just have a 0-second bomb timer, have it detonate as soon as it hits the ground. On the other hand, if you're doing something like a dive bomber where your risk of pulling up in time, you really want to have a longer timer so you can have a chance to get away. What I would broadly say is that if you're unsure about your bomb timer, you should definitely do some trial and error in the test flight. The test flight is definitely your friend when it comes to both practicing your drops and also when it comes to refining your bomb timer so you know about how much time you have. As a general rule, the default timer I use for a lot of the World War II era planes is 1.5 seconds. That will generally give you enough time to get away from the blast radius, but also generally won't give your opponents that much time to do anything. But of course, that's going to vary a bit from plane to plane, from bomb to bomb. Your mileage may vary. So now we have a bit of a physics lesson that has to come with bombs because that is how bombs work. They just use physics. When you drop a bomb, you are less dropping it than you are throwing it. The bomb drops from your plane, it is now going the speed that you are going. So if you're going 500 kilometers an hour, your bomb is also going 500 kilometers an hour. And the bomb is also going in the same direction you're going, it's just going towards the ground faster than you are because you're generating lift. This also brings up another point. The mass of an object doesn't matter in terms of how fast it reaches the ground. So all bombs, no matter how big or small, will fall at the same speed unless they have something specifically speeding them up or slowing them down. So this is the reason why if you get pretty good at guessing bomb arcs at a certain speed, you can basically do it no matter how big or small the bomb is, and this is why you can mix and match bomb loads and not have any problem having to figure out where a bomb is going. In this respect, you can actually do a full toss bombing where you pull the plane up in a sharp arc and throw it. However, with a lot of these World War II bombers, it is incredibly difficult to be accurate with this. It's kind of just a meme tactic unless you get a ton of practice, and I wouldn't really recommend it, as most players are not really going to be able to get the bomb arc correct on this. And of course, discussions of bomb arcs will inevitably lead to discussion of bomb sites. Some bombers, specifically dive bombers, will have a dive bombing site for their bombs, which will either be the one you see on screen or it'll be a grid pattern. The problem with these dive bomb sites is that if you're in ground realistic, there's not really a reason to use them. These are mostly for simulator battles, and it takes a lot of practice to figure out exactly what all the signage on the site means, and also get used to exactly how your plane is oriented, what speed you're going, etc. just by like look and feel. At the end of the day, you might as well just use a third-person camera for this if you're in realistic, because you're going to be just as accurate with some practice. So unless you're just playing sim battles a lot, there's no reason to really use these. The next type of bomb site is more for level bombing. This is on like things like B-25s, B-17s, whatever. Generally medium and heavy bombers, sometimes on lighter bombers. This allows you to essentially fly the bomber in level flight and drop the bombs reasonably accurately. It's a nice tool. The problem is it's pretty slow and unresponsive. So unless you're just targeting something like the enemy spawn or like a specific capture point that's being fought over, by the time the bombs get there, the enemies could have already completely moved out. So it's not the most useful, but it's not bad. It is reasonably accurate and easy to use, and it's not anywhere near as disorienting as the dive bomb site. And of course, you always want to make sure you have your bomb bays open when you go to bomb. Now, when you hit the bomb release button, you will notice the bomb bays start opening automatically. However, this will add a delay to dropping your bombs. So if you're in position right now, when you start hitting the button, By the time the bomb bay doors open, your opportunity to drop could have already ended. So make sure you have your doors open before you actually go to initiate a drop. Also, kind of in keeping with that, there are a few bombers like the American SBD Dauntless and the Ju-87 Stuka. These are dive bombers, and they actually have a trapeze underneath the bomber that will swing the bomb out to get it clear of the plane, make sure it doesn't hit the propeller or anything like that. The problem is this does add a slight delay between when you hit the button and when the bomb actually drops. So when you hit the button, it's always a good idea with both these bombers to stay in level flight for a fraction of a second after you hit the button and then pull up, as opposed to pulling up right away, where if you do that, the trapeze will just launch the bomb off into the distance. And of course, since we're talking about dive bombers, it's a good time to discuss dive brakes or air brakes. Dive brakes or air brakes both use the same toggle to turn them on, and they're essentially brakes that will slow down your plane's terminal velocity significantly, and with the lower terminal velocity you'll have a much easier time pulling up if you're in a very steep angle, even in an outright 90 degrees. So it's important when you go into a bombing run to both cut your engines and pop the dive brakes so you have a much lower terminal velocity. It kind of just depends on the plane. Some planes can pull up at a higher velocity, some planes can't. This is one of those things that, much like with a lot of the other factors, you kind of want to test in the test drive to see how easily the plane can pull up and recover. Typically with a lot of the dive bombers, they pull up and recover very easily. They usually have a very large wing surface area, but if you're using things that aren't specifically a dive bomber, you may have some issues with this and you may have to start pulling up a lot sooner. A big example would be heavy planes like the P-47 Thunderbolt. A lot of new players really struggle with that because pulling up in time with the P-47 can be quite difficult. Now, as far as your angle for dropping a bomb, usually the best angle is actually a 45 degrees, even if you're in something like a dive bomber. Trying to do perfectly level bombing is difficult because, as I discussed, your bomb is moving as fast as you are, so it's going to move forward a lot more than it will normally. So it's a little bit difficult to predict this arc unless you have something like a ballistic computer, which we won't go into until the next episode. Additionally, if you start going straight down, now your bomb isn't quite moving straight down. It'll have some forward speed or some speed in some direction. It just kind of depends because you're not going exactly down, you'll be drifting, and that can be a little awkward to aim as well. So you usually want anywhere between, again, like a 45 to 60 degree angle is usually the best attack solution, unless you have something like an anti-air that you want to drop on top of, in which case you want to go directly above them and drop straight down that way, because a lot of guns actually can't shoot straight up. And of course, the last little detail when you're testing bombs in the test flight is you want to know which bombs are dropping at which time and whether they're dropping individually or in pairs. Some bombers still have their bombs dropping as a pair. The American P-51 Mustangs, I believe, all drop as pairs, and I believe even some of the P-47's bombs drop as pairs. However, the F-6F Hellcat, the F-4U Corsair, things like that, all drop all of their bombs individually. So obviously, individual drops, you have more damage potential if you're landing your bombs, but you also have to know which of the bombs is dropping. If it's like a bomb on the far left of the plane, you need to know that when you're dropping versus a bomb on the far right, because they might have slightly different arcs. Obviously, the best uses for bombs are either A, when you have a bunch of targets clustered together, or B, you have particularly heavy targets that you're not sure you can really deal with either guns or rockets. At the end of the day, the best ground attack aircraft usually have a mix of weapon systems to deal with both lighter and heavier targets, and that really is what you should be looking for when you're looking at aircraft. If you were to ask me what my personal favorite ground attack aircraft are in the game of War Thunder, it would almost certainly be the American F-4U 4B Corsair. That plane has two 1,000 pound bombs, two 250 pound bombs, can drop all four of them individually. The 4B model also has four 20mm A&M2 cannons, which can top down even vehicles like Panthers pretty reliably and can shred things like anti-air. It's also just generally a pretty good fighter for taking on other planes, but that's going to be for a later video. Overall, I just think the F-4U 4B Corsair has a fantastic mix, with a close second being the F-6F Hellcat with its two 1,000 pound bombs and 6 HVARs. That's also a pretty fantastic plane. But those are just my picks. Feel free to let me know what your favorite low-tier CAS options are down in the comments below, and that'll wrap up our video for today. Make sure to stay tuned for the next video in the series, and if you want to make sure you don't miss it, you should obviously like and subscribe. That would really help out the channel. Hope you enjoyed the video, hope you found it educational, hope you found it fun. Have a great day, everybody!